Does the narrator present Ehud's assassination of Eglon in a positive or negative light? Statement of the problem. From the point of view of this paper, the problem of whether the narrator of Judges 3:12-30 presents Ehud's assassination of Eglon in a positive or negative light hinges on whether the narrator viewed the killing as an unethical murder or as an act of war in the ancient Near East. If the first option is taken, then Ehud killed a figurehead king who was an innocent civilian. Two options are possible if the ancient Near East context is considered. One, Ehud was a vassal leader who betrayed his oath of allegiance in his promise to love his Moabite benefactor. Or two, he was a military leader in essentially a suicidal mission, committing what amounts to an act of war against the military leader of a hostile and oppressive foreign nation. At stake here is the impact each interpretation has on the section of the book where the story is found, and in the overall message of the book. Conversely, how one sees the rhetorical strategy of the section in the book informs the analysis of this individual story. This is where a gap seems to exist in the consideration of this dilemma, highlighting the importance of reaching a solution. This paper will offer a discourse analysis approach to the solution, which has the advantage of a highly objective approach. Finding out where the killing is collocated in the plot structure of the story reveals how the author/narrator sees the incident. This defines not only the method through which the problem will be addressed, but also the purpose for which it is addressed, namely, to help improve how the story, the section, and the book are understood. Interpretive options. In the interest of not rehearsing what has been said up to Wong's article in 2006 and Chisholm's in 2011, this paper will report on the state of the problem in more recent works. View 1. The assassination is presented as mostly negative but somewhat ambiguous. This is done by Hamley, Younger, and Nelson, and their works are in the footnotes. The traditional negative view of Wong was based on the intertextuality between the assassination stories of Ehud and Joab in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Today's negative view is more confined to the Ehud story itself. However, it does have a new component of ambiguity. Hamley, for instance, has a negative view of the story. She says Ehud's individual violence toward Eglon leads to the corporate violence of Israel against Moab. Underlying questions in Judges about the nature of justice and its interweaving with mercy prompt uneasy reflections. However, she reveals an ambivalence by veering toward ambiguity. One may wonder whether the assassination was wise, necessary, or even useful in the sequence of events. The narrative gives no indication either way, leaving readers to ponder the morality of Ehud's actions. Younger also shares a negative view of Ehud's actions. Is the narrator concerned about the morality of the affair? I find this difficult to accept from both the immediate context as well as the canonical reading. And like Hamley, he introduces ambiguity, although in his case, it consists of a theological construct. Is it possible and perhaps, no, I'm sorry, it is possible and perhaps preferable to see Ehud's story operating on both the human and divine levels. He depends on his own crafty, stealthy, deceptive plot to assassinate Eglon. He is treacherous and brutal, yet God uses him in spite of his flaws. Nelson rejects the humorous take on the story others embrace, offers a negative evaluation of it, and uses the same theological ambiguity of Younger. Because of Eglon's supposedly incapacitating obesity, some choose to read Ehud's exploit as shameful and less than heroic, rather than as a shrewd tactic by an admired trickster. From a theological perspective, the Ehud story is a good illustration of the principle of dual divine and human causality. One thing these authors share is a concern for how the contemporary reader will perceive Ehud's story. In this paper's proposed reading, we will be concerned with how the author/narrator presented the story. View number 2. The assassination is presented as humorous but negative. This is the view of Schroeder and Oslus. The humorous dimension of our story is universally recognized, yet some see it in a negative rather than a positive light. Schroeder exemplifies this. He assigns the story an ethic of tricksterism, adding that the text wields humor as an irregular weapon of resistance. His negative take on the humor of the story is evident when he writes, Eglon's oozing corpse and the odor it emits contributes to a crude revelry indeed. And it is precisely amid this merriment that Judges 3:12-30 does its most serious and enduring work. Oslus also recognizes the humor of the story and likewise pronounces it negative. For instance, he describes the story as the clever yet brutal murder of the Moabite King Eglon, and the brutal murder of Eglon, and the fact that the Lord ruthlessly delivers the Moabite king into Israel's hands. Oslus goes as far as indicting God as the author of violent cruelty. God and violence are inseparable in the Old Testament, regardless of how many texts also bring a peaceful and loving God to the fore. Classifying the story as ethnic humor, he concludes that the Israelites must undoubtedly have grinned with malicious pleasure. View 3, the assassination is presented as humorous and positive. This is the view of Boda, Smith and Magnus. It is surprising that Boda's commentary, A Discourse Analysis of Judges, comments on the story's parts, but is short of a treatment of the story as a whole. However, in the little that we have, Boda embraces the humor of the story but does not see it as negative. The text recounts the story of Ehud and Eglon not in an objective and dignified way, but with satire, including mockery and coarse humor. Smith attempt to place the story in its Engineer East Iron II period. They call the story a piece of political entertainment, a satire of the Moabites in the context of their Iron II relations with Israel, an entertaining parody of the Moabite leader and his attendants. The Ehud story serves to reinforce Israel's social boundaries with Moab. Although Magnus's article is not an exposition of the story, her research into the scatological humor of the story is insightful. I had to look up the word scatological because, of course, it does not refer to the end times prophecies, but it's actually a humor based on fecal matter, on poop. That's what that means. So we continue. Her concluding comment exemplifies the view that takes the humor of the story as positive. I believe that an accurate understanding of this episode, which must have had the Israelites' audience roaring with laughter, has been impeded by a lack of familiarity with ancient toilets and toilet habits, and perhaps a modern Western reluctance to acknowledge the existence of eschatological humor in the Hebrew Bible. Now, my discourse approach. The discourse analysis of Judges 3:12-30 presented in the appendix to this paper provides the basis for the following plot structure of this story unit. And the plot structure is context, setting, the setting describing Israel and Ehud. It is a rather long context setting. It takes almost 5 verses, between verses 12 and 17. Then we have the conflict, which is the escalating tension that reaches a crisis with Eglon's death. This goes from verse 17b to 25. The climax plus resolution is Israel confronts and defeats Moab in verses 26 to 29. And then we have the core, which, if you've heard me before, I used to call this the consequence, but I changed the terminology here to core, as in the core message. And it is that Israel subdues Moab in verse 30a, and the conclusion is that the land had rest for 80 years in verse 30b. Let me now get into the details as to why do I organize the story in this way. Right, so this structure differs from most outlines, not considering Ehud's killing of Eglon as the climactic point of the story, but rather as still part of the conflict or tension building pre-peak. The fronted disjunctive clause, noun plus katal, that opens verse 26, serves as a sectional divider initiating a subunit in the story. This is supported by the 6 participles that end the conflict section in verses 24 and 25, slowing down the action to a halt as it describes Eglon's fall and death. The section started in verse 26 is indeed the climax of the story, and we make this decision based on 3 arguments. First, verse 26 opens a new story section that goes to verse 29 in an inclusio formed by the katal nimlat in both verses. Ehud escaped, but the Moabites did not. Escape is the meaning of nimlat. Second, the section offers little verbal variation with the rest of the story, which is the primary marker of climax. But nonetheless, we have a verbal variation with the key action of the whole story, which is Ehud's command to Israel in verse 28, pursue them. The imperative sentence is closed by the expository ex katal perfective, ki natan, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands. And third, the imperative and its reason ties the story to the section in which it is collocated in the plot of the book. Although part of the longest section of the book, this story is found toward the beginning of Judges' cycle of apostasy that makes up the bulk of the book's conflict. I concluded the last paragraph speaking of the plot of the book, but I want to take you to the plot of the book in my footnote 11, which is first the context that Judah continues the unfinished conquest of Canaan, coming from Joshua, of course, and then the conflict of Judges is that Israel failed to conquer Canaan and Jerusalem, and God left some nations living in the land. This gets complicated by the fact that Israel committed apostasy, failing in their allegiance to the Lord. This is going to be a key reference to Joshua. This is the bulk of the book, chapters 2-16. And then we reach the crisis, which is Gibeah's apostasy shocks Israel in chapters 17 and 19. Then we get the climax, which is Israel confronts and defeats Gibeah of Benjamin. That's the conflict that we see, and the resolution, and not the conflict, but the confrontation. And the resolution is that the tribe of Benjamin is preserved. Then we get the core message of Judges, which is that in the days of the Judges, there was no king in Israel. This is, well known, but not established as the core message of the book. And then the conclusion is that there was no righteousness. In Israel, everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes, right? All right. So we resume here that although part of the longest section of the book, this story is found toward the beginning of Judges' cycle of apostasy that makes up the bulk of the book's conflict, of the book of Judges. So this story of Ehud is part of the conflict of the book. It's towards the beginning. This makes tying this story to the core message of the book premature. Rather, the story makes a point as part of its plot section. The plot of Joshua must also be kept in mind throughout all of Judges, particularly Joshua's core message that Israel was warned against apostasy and swore allegiance. Let me show you then now footnote 12 with the plot structure of Joshua. So here we have the context is Israel enters the land. Then we have the conflict. Israel is commanded to take Jericho. And the complication one is Israel is defeated by Ai, and Israel is deceived by the Gibeonites. Then we come into the climax of Joshua, which is that Israel defeats the inhabitants of the land. And the resolution is that Israel takes possession of the land. That takes us all the way to chapter 21. Then we get the core message of Joshua. This is extremely important, especially for Judges. And that core message is that Israel is warned against apostasy, and Israel swears allegiance. This allegiance, of course, is going to be broken immediately in the book of Judges, and that warning against apostasy becomes a reality. The book then concludes with the death and burial of Joshua and Joseph and Eliezer. So we come back, and we were in the plot of Joshua. So the plot of Joshua must also be kept in mind throughout all of Judges, particularly Joshua's core message that Israel was warned against apostasy and swore allegiance. Judges, and particularly the cycle of apostasy of chapters 2 to 16, is in direct connection to Joshua's core message. So the Ehud story ends with a Vayikol sentence in the conclusion that the land was undisturbed for 80 years in verse 30b. But prior to that, in verse 30a, we have the story's core message in another Vayikol sentence. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel. This is in internal coherence with the imperative climactic sentence of verse 28 that says, "For the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands." So we see the hands, the yad, as the providing the internal coherence. This belongs to the cycle of apostasy as a high point in the contrast to the low points, also in coherence with the section to which the story belongs. So the point must be made that these plot decisions are based on the story's internal cohesion. That is, they are based on verbal and discourse markers. This adds to a high degree of objectivity to the decisions made in determining the boundaries of the story's plot components. We are now ready to return to the focus of this paper, which is whether the narrator views the story in a positive or negative light. I assume in this paper that by the narrator, it is also meant the author. As such, we could say that half of his or her contribution are the words of the story, and the other half is his or her arrangement of the story. In other words, the plot structure we have determined above and based on the appendix are part of the communication we receive from this author narrator. And the one thing he or she does, which is key to our inquiry, is to choose to collocate the killing of Eglon by Ehud as preamble to Israel's defeat of the Moabites. As disciplined readers, we must refrain from emphasizing what the author does not, but emphasize what the story emphasizes, which is first the climax, as marked by verbal and discourse markers, and above all, the plot's core message, which ties the whole story to the section to which it belongs through coherence. To put it simply, our author narrator is not too concerned with the way Eglon dies. For him or her, that is secondary. Now, having established this, however, we must also consider the context of the narrator to be above the context of any reader, particularly the modern one. We suggest here that the modern reader's ethical concern with Ehud's killing of Eglon must be replaced with an understanding of the killing as an act of war in the context of the ancient Near East. Furthermore, the Deuteronomistic concerns against the Canaanization of Ehud must be tempered by Moab's aggression against Israel, Eglon's idolatry in seeking a word from the gods, and the command to conduct a war of dispossession against the inhabitants of the land. Ehud's assassination of Eglon is more Deuteronomistic than it is Canaanite. The humorous and positive view of the killing presented by Boda, Smith and Magnus have not been repeated, but they are in complement to the discourse features offered here, making it a more complete treatment of the story.